Welcome to Pushback. I'm Aaron Maté. The shooting massacre that killed at least 20 people and wounded 26 others in El Paso, Texas, is being investigated as an act of domestic terrorism. The shooter reportedly published a screed online decrying the, quote, Hispanic invasion of Texas, unquote. The text also pays tribute to the Christchurch shooter in New Zealand, who murdered 51 people at two mosques in March. In Western countries around the world, white supremacist violence is the largest source of domestic terrorism. According to the New York Times, there were nearly 350 white extremist terrorism attacks in Europe, North America, and Australia from 2011 to 2017. The El Paso massacre comes just days after FBI Director Christopher Wray warned that white supremacists account for the vast majority of domestic terror cases in the U.S.
And I will say that a majority of the domestic terrorism cases that we've investigated are motivated by some version of what you might call white supremacist violence, but it includes other things as well.
Gerald Horne is an author, historian, and professor of history and African American studies at the University of Houston. From your perspective, I'm wondering, what do you think is important for us to think about as we react to yet another white supremacist mass shooting, this time coming in Texas, a history obviously fraught with white supremacy?
Well, I think in the first instance, we need to think more honestly and sincerely about the bloodstained history of this country. My very presence on your program is an exemplar of the African slave trade, in the sense that I'm a descendant of enslaved Africans in Mississippi. That is to say that oftentimes I think that many of our liberal friends have put forward a prettified history narrative of the history of this country, totally eliding many unpleasant episodes, such as genocide against Native Americans, such as the basis for the Second Amendment itself, which was designed to arm settlers so that they could better fight Native Americans and repress revolts by enslaved Africans, such as the ugly history of the 45th president's hero, speaking of President Andrew Jackson, a slave trader in Tennessee, a man who masterminded the massive removal of indigenous people from the southeastern quadrant of the United States of America to a land in Oklahoma, which was supposed to be theirs, then that was taken. And so until we come to grips with this ugly history, I think we're always going to be shocked and surprised by the contemporary manifestations of that ugliness.
I'm wondering if you talk to us about the specific Texas history when it comes to racist violence. This shooter supposedly was an adherent to this theory about the Great Replacement, this notion that migrants are coming to take the jobs of European whites. And I was thinking about it, and one thing that struck me was that the fear that these white supremacists have, this idea that they have, in some ways is a projection of one aspect of Texas's and many other states' own history, in the sense that Texas used to belong to Mexico. It was the white Americans who came in, illegally immigrated basically, squatted, and then started a insurrection and captured that territory from Mexico.
Well, I think you're onto something. Stephen F. Austin, Sam Houston, and their comrades occupied Mexico-dominated Texas as early as the 1820s. But what happened was that it was in the 1820s that Mexico moved to abolish slavery. Stephen F. Austin and many of his comrades were slave owners, and that led directly to the so-called Texas Revolution of 1836, a mini-me of the Confederate States of America, insofar as, just like the Confederate States of America seceded in 1861 to perpetuate slavery forevermore, Austin and Sam Houston and company seceded from Mexico in 1836 in order to perpetuate slavery forevermore. But what happened was that they could not withstand the pressure from abolitionist Britain and revolutionary Haiti, and therefore crawled into the United States of America by way of annexation in 1845, and Texas has been part of the United States ever since. But I think that if you want to really understand the bloodstained history of Texas and what has been directed at Mexicans, you need to look at the period between 1910 and 1920. That is to say, the period of the Mexican Revolution. I think it's fair to say that around 1916, 1917, the kind of episode that you saw in El Paso within the last 24 hours was normative. It was happening on a daily, if not weekly basis. That is to say, the massacring of people of Mexican origin on both sides of the border, that is to say, Mexican Americans and Mexicans themselves, the lynching of people in Texas in particular, because of the upheaval unleashed by the Mexican Revolution, which is one of the reasons I was sort of taken aback when certain contemporary commentators suggested that this El Paso episode was the largest mass killing of people of Mexican origin in the history of the United States of America. I think they need to go back to the period before period of 1910 to 1920. I should also say that I'm hopeful that the government in Mexico City will take aggressive measures to make sure that their nationals who cross into the United States are not massacred willy-nilly. Likewise, I take it and I hope and I trust that the government in Mexico City will also try to extend protection to U.S. nationals of Mexican origin on this side of the border. I think that that's long overdue.
And let me ask you about President Trump. So white supremacist violence obviously predates President Trump, but there's no doubt that he looms very large here. The rhetoric he employs, running an openly xenophobic campaign, talking about an invasion from the South, which is a term that I believe the shooter here used as well. How do you see President Trump's role in all this and his place in history when it comes to stoking white supremacy?
Well, what you need to know about President Trump is that his hero, as aforementioned, is Andrew Jackson, a former slave trader, a former slave owner, a man who in many ways represents an embodiment of white nationalism and right-wing racist populism. Mr. Trump, by speaking in June 2015 when he announced his candidacy of so-called Mexican rapists, Mr. Trump has opened Pandora's box. He's unleashed a tidal wave of xenophobia, and it's very difficult for him to now disclaim any responsibility for this monster that he has helped to create. Certainly, I hope and I trust that this unfortunate episode in El Paso in particular will add fuel to this ongoing campaign to impeach Mr. Trump sooner rather than later and forthwith remove him from office by dint of a trial in the U.S. Senate.
One thing I want to ask you about also when it comes to Trump is he ran by falsely portraying himself as a working class champion, and while at the same time pushing a xenophobic message and tapping into white supremacy and white supremacist feelings. I'm wondering if you could talk about the connection there between working class grievances and white supremacy, because I've heard you argue before that actually there's a connection between a decline in labor power in unions in this country and in fact the rise of white supremacy.
Well, absolutely. I think that the decline of the class project in general, not only unions, but the decline of the socialist project globally and internationally, like a seesaw, has given rise to a virulent form of right-wing populism and white nationalism that has various manifestations, not only in the United States of America, but with regard to the neo-fascists in Italy, with regard to the Alternative for Germany party in Berlin, with regard to the Brexit party and Nigel Farage, indeed with regard to the current iteration of the Tories led by Prime Minister Boris Johnson. In all of these countries I've mentioned, to a greater or lesser degree, you've seen a decline of unions, you've seen an unleashing of anti-communism in particular, and anti-socialism most recently, and that has helped to give fuel to this kind of right-wing populist nationalism that now is coursing across North America from the Atlantic to the Pacific.
We're going to wrap here, but I want to ask you, Dr. Horne, if you have any final words. We haven't even touched on the whole gun issue, the Second Amendment, and the unprecedented status the U.S. has, seeing so many mass killings involving assault rifles.
Well, certainly the gun issue needs to be mentioned, and there are a number of issues that need to be mentioned, but I think that many commentators are reluctant to bring them up because they want to keep the focus, perhaps justifiably and understandably, on this neo-fascist white nationalism. I'm thinking, for example, of the mental health issue. It's rather fine, I might say, that in Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All program, he has an initiative that would help to cover mental health treatment, which is something that we desperately need in the United States of America. But I think it's many commentators are reluctant to bring up this issue of mental health because they think it lets the perpetrators, the alleged killers, off the hook. And certainly mental health is not brought up when Mr. Trump refers to what he calls radical Islamic terrorism. So obviously we have a very difficult uphill climb in terms of trying to bring to heel this kind of violence, this kind of racist violence that we have seen unleashed in Southwest Texas in recent hours.
Gerald Horne, author, professor of history and African American studies at the University of Houston. Thanks very much.
Thank you.